Sometimes the greatest act of courage is not saving the world. Sometimes it is simply opening your front door. Ethan Brooks had learned long ago that life rarely rewarded good people with easy answers. Yet every morning he still chose kindness because it was the only inheritance he wanted to leave his 8-year-old daughter, Lily. Their small farmhouse rested at the edge of a quiet Montana valley where endless pine forests stretched toward distant mountains. And beside the house stood the modest repair garage Ethan had built with his own hands after his wife passed away years earlier. Business was never spectacular, but every truck he repaired, every handshake he honored, and every customer who trusted him reminded him that dignity was measured by character rather than wealth. On that cold October evening, heavy rain swept across the gravel road with relentless determination, rattling every window and filling the night with a steady rhythm of water striking the old tin roof. Lily had already fallen asleep upstairs beneath her favorite blue knitted blanket, while Ethan remained in the kitchen, finishing a cup of black coffee and reviewing invoices that never seemed to become any smaller. The lights flickered once as thunder rolled across the valley, followed by a sudden knock that echoed through the quiet house. It was not the hesitant knock of a neighbor or the confident knock of a customer. It sounded uncertain, almost apologetic, as though whoever stood outside expected rejection before the door even opened. Ethan placed his coffee mug on the wooden table and walked toward the front entrance without hesitation. As he pulled the door open, freezing wind and rain rushed inside. Standing on the porch was a woman in her mid-30s wearing a soaked beige wool coat that clung heavily to her shoulders. Long blonde hair framed a pale face marked by exhaustion rather than fear, while striking blue eyes searched his with the cautious hope of someone who had stopped expecting kindness from strangers. She held no luggage except a small leather bag, and despite her elegant appearance, there was something deeply human about the quiet vulnerability she could no longer hide. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said softly. "My car broke down several miles back. I only need somewhere warm until morning." Ethan glanced toward the dark road, disappearing in a sheets of rain. No tow truck would reach this valley before sunrise, and no hotel existed within 30 miles. Before he could answer, distant headlights appeared through the storm. 3 black luxury SUVs slowed near the entrance of the property before stopping several hundred feet away. Their engines continued idling, their headlights cutting bright paths through the rain without anyone stepping outside. The woman noticed them immediately. Her breathing became shallow, and for the briefest moment, she looked as though she might disappear back into the storm rather than bring trouble to another person's home. Ethan followed her gaze, but asked no questions. Years of raising Lily alone had taught him that people often carried invisible burdens heavier than anything they admitted aloud. Instead, he reached for the old blue blanket hanging beside the doorway and gently placed it over her trembling shoulders. "You look like you could use a hot meal," he said with the same calm voice he used whenever Lily woke frightened after a nightmare. "Come inside before you catch pneumonia." The woman hesitated only a second before stepping across the threshold. As Ethan quietly closed the door behind her, shutting out the cold rain and the silent SUVs waiting beyond the darkness, neither of them realized that one simple act of compassion had already begun changing both of their lives forever. The warmth inside the farmhouse wrapped around the woman almost as gently as the blue knitted blanket resting across her shoulders. She remained quietly near the doorway for a moment, as though she had forgotten what it felt like to stand somewhere without being watched or judged. Ethan walked toward the old cast-iron stove and lifted the lid from a simmering pot of homemade chicken soup that had filled the kitchen with the comforting aroma of herbs, vegetables, and slow-cooked broth since late afternoon. He reached into the cupboard for another bowl without asking another question because he believed that hungry people deserved food before conversations. Upstairs, the wooden floor creaked softly as Lily stepped into the hallway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Her long brown hair was slightly messy, and she still wore her favorite oversized sweater decorated with tiny pine trees. She stopped halfway down the staircase when she noticed the unfamiliar guest standing quietly in the kitchen. Ethan smiled gently. "Everything is all right," he said. Our guest had some bad luck with the weather. Lily looked toward the woman, then toward the rain, striking the windows before offering the innocent smile that only children could give without hesitation. You can sit in my favorite chair, she said. It is the warmest one in the house. The woman blinked several times, surprised by kindness that carried no conditions. Thank you, she answered softly. My name is Claire. Ethan introduced himself and Lily before placing a steaming bowl of soup on the wooden table alongside slices of fresh bread that he had baked that morning. Claire hesitated only briefly before taking the first spoonful. The warmth seemed to melt away hours of exhaustion hidden behind her composed appearance. For the first time that day, her shoulders relaxed. Outside, rain continued falling across the valley, while the headlights from the distant sport utility vehicles remained visible through the kitchen window like silent stars refusing to disappear. Claire noticed them again and instinctively looked away. Ethan followed her eyes, but chose silence over curiosity. He had learned that trust could never be demanded. It had to arrive on its own. Lily climbed onto her chair and began talking cheerfully about school, her science project, and a stray orange cat that occasionally wandered into the garage searching for scraps of food. Claire listened with genuine attention, smiling more naturally with every passing minute until quiet laughter finally replaced the tension she had carried through the front door. The farmhouse felt different now, filled not only with warmth but with something even rarer. It felt safe. After dinner, Ethan carried the empty bowls to the sink while Lily disappeared upstairs before, returning with neatly folded blankets and a small handmade quilt. You can use these tonight, she said proudly. Dad says guests should always sleep comfortably. Claire accepted them carefully, her blue eyes glistening beneath the soft kitchen light. She thanked Lily with a voice barely louder than a whisper. Ethan showed Claire to the small guest room overlooking the pine trees where simple wooden furniture, clean white curtains, and a handmade quilt reflected years of modest but honest living. Before closing the door, he paused for a moment. You do not have to explain anything tonight, he said calmly. Tomorrow will still be there when the sun comes up. Claire looked at him with quiet disbelief because she had spent years surrounded by people who always expected answers before offering compassion. As Ethan switched off the hallway light and the farmhouse settled into peaceful silence, the three black sport utility vehicles remained parked far beyond the property line, waiting patiently beneath the endless Montana rain while, for the first time in a very long time, Claire allowed herself to believe that perhaps home was not always the place you left behind. Sometimes it was the place where someone simply chose to let you stay. Morning arrived quietly across the Montana Valley as sunlight filtered through the tall pine trees and painted long golden lines across the farmhouse porch. The storm had disappeared, leaving behind crisp autumn air that carried the scent of wet earth and fresh cedar. Ethan had already started preparing breakfast before sunrise, just as he did every morning, while Lily carefully packed her school backpack at the kitchen table. Claire stepped into the room, wearing one of Ethan's clean flannel shirts over her clothes while her beige coat dried beside the fireplace. She looked noticeably different. The exhaustion remained in her eyes, but it no longer completely overshadowed the quiet strength beneath it. Lily smiled as though Claire had always belonged there. Dad makes the best pancakes in Montana, she announced proudly. Ethan laughed softly while placing another stack onto a plate. That is only because nobody else is here to argue with her. Claire smiled with genuine amusement, a simple expression that felt unfamiliar after years of carefully measured public appearances and endless boardroom meetings. Breakfast passed with comfortable conversation about the changing leaves, the first snowfall that would arrive in a few weeks, and Lily's upcoming science fair. No one mentioned the black sport utility vehicles that had disappeared before dawn, although Claire noticed their tire tracks still pressed into the wet gravel beyond the driveway. After Lily boarded the school bus, Ethan headed toward the repair garage, expecting another ordinary day. Claire followed several steps behind, asking quietly whether she could help organize the office while waiting for her car to be repaired. Ethan nodded without hesitation. If you do not mind old paperwork and too much dust, you are welcome to try. Inside the garage, The familiar sounds of air compressors, metal tools, and country music filled the building as regular customers stopped by with pickup trucks and family vehicles needing routine repairs. Ethan worked steadily beneath the hood of an aging Ford truck while Claire sat inside the tiny office, surrounded by handwritten invoices, overflowing appointment notebooks, loose receipts, and years of customer records stacked into uneven piles. She carefully examined everything without judgment. Within an hour, she had sorted invoices by date, arranged repair orders into simple folders, created an easy appointment calendar, and labeled shelves that Ethan had not touched in years. Every change looked so natural that it almost seemed obvious, yet somehow no one had ever thought to organize the space that way before. Around lunchtime, Ethan stepped inside, carrying 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. He stopped in the doorway and looked around with quiet surprise. The cluttered office suddenly felt twice as large. Important paperwork could actually be found without searching through several boxes. Customer phone numbers were arranged alphabetically, and tomorrow's schedule rested neatly beside the cash register. Ethan smiled with sincere appreciation. "You have been busy." Claire looked slightly embarrassed. "I hope you do not mind. I only enjoy making complicated things a little easier." Ethan glanced around again before laughing softly. "You probably save me several hours every week." Claire accepted the compliment with a humble nod, careful not to reveal that organizing businesses worth billions of dollars had once been considered routine. As the afternoon continued, she quietly observed the way Ethan treated every customer with equal respect regardless of whether they drove an old pickup worth only a few $1,000s or a newer family sport utility vehicle. He explained every repair honestly, never recommended unnecessary work, and always made time to answer questions. Watching him reminded Claire of something she had almost forgotten existed in the business world: trust. Late in the afternoon, while Ethan finished replacing brake pads outside, Claire stepped briefly behind the garage where no one could see her. She removed a small phone from the inner pocket of her coat, powered it on for only a few seconds, and read dozens of unanswered messages before quietly sending a single short reply. "I'm safe. Do not come here." She immediately switched the phone off again, unaware that far beyond the hills surrounding the peaceful valley, one message was enough to begin changing everything. The next several days settled into a peaceful rhythm that neither Ethan nor Claire had expected, as though the quiet Montana valley had gently pressed pause on the hurried pace of the outside world. Every morning began with fresh coffee, homemade breakfast, and Lily laughing about something that had happened at school, while every afternoon ended with the comforting sounds of air tools, pickup trucks, and customers leaving the little repair garage with grateful smiles. Claire slowly became part of that rhythm without ever trying to take control of it. She answered phone calls with warmth, scheduled appointments more efficiently, greeted customers by name after meeting them only once, and somehow remembered every repair order without needing to search through paperwork. Ethan noticed that people lingered a little longer than before, not because they had complaints, but because they genuinely enjoyed visiting the garage. Business gradually improved, although Ethan believed it was simply because autumn always brought more maintenance work before winter arrived. Claire quietly smiled every time he said that, choosing not to explain that trust often grew faster when people felt truly welcomed. One cool evening after closing the garage, Ethan and Lily sat on the wooden porch watching the sunset paint the mountains with shades of orange and gold, while Claire joined them carrying 3 steaming mugs of hot chocolate. The cool breeze carried the scent of pine needles and distant fireplaces as silence settled comfortably between them. It was the kind of silence that never demanded conversation because everyone present already felt understood. Lily leaned gently against Claire and pointed toward the first stars appearing above the valley. "Dad says every person deserves a second chance," she said innocently. "Do you believe that?" Claire looked toward the fading sunlight before answering. "I think some people spend their whole lives hoping someone else believes that about them." Ethan quietly nodded without asking who she meant. He had learned that healing often arrived long before explanations. The following morning, as Ethan prepared to open the garage, He noticed fresh tire tracks leading toward the edge of his property. A few hundred yards away, parked beside the county road, sat two familiar black sport utility vehicles. They remained there only briefly before driving away without approaching the farmhouse. Ethan watched them disappear, but simply returned to work. Claire noticed them as well, and for a brief moment the peace in her expression faded. She instinctively reached into the pocket of her coat, where the small phone remained switched off. She resisted turning it on. Every hour she remained in Montana felt like borrowed time. Yet every hour also reminded her what life looked like before schedules, headlines, shareholder meetings, and impossible expectations had consumed every part of her identity. That afternoon, while organizing another stack of customer records, Claire overheard two longtime customers talking near the front counter about a national news story. One man unfolded a newspaper and pointed toward a photograph on the business page, though the image was too far away for Ethan to notice clearly. "Still no sign of that chief executive officer," one customer remarked. "The television says her company is worth billions, and nobody knows where she went." The other man shook his head thoughtfully. "Money cannot buy peace, I guess." Claire quietly lowered her eyes and continued filing paperwork while Ethan simply smiled and replied, "I hope wherever she is, somebody is treating her with kindness." His words landed more deeply than he could possibly imagine. Claire paused for only a heartbeat before returning to her work, silently realizing that the greatest difference between the world she had left behind and the one she had found in Montana was not measured by wealth, influence, or success. It was measured by a man who could offer compassion to someone he had never met, never judged, and never expected to meet at all, even as the distance between her hidden truth and its inevitable discovery grew shorter with every passing day. 5 days after Claire first arrived, the quiet rhythm of the Montana Valley was interrupted by a line of polished black sport utility vehicles turning slowly onto the gravel road leading toward Ethan's repair garage. The engines stopped one after another with quiet precision, and several men and women dressed in tailored business suits stepped outside. They did not carry the confidence of people arriving to inspect a business. Instead, they carried the unmistakable relief of people who had finally found someone they had been searching for across the country. Ethan looked up from replacing the radiator on an old pickup truck and wiped his hands with a clean shop towel before walking forward with his usual calm smile. "Good morning," he said politely. "Can I help you with something?" The oldest gentleman in the group looked beyond Ethan before his eyes settled on Claire, who had just stepped out of the office carrying a folder of customer invoices. For a brief moment, time itself seemed to pause. Claire closed her eyes gently, realizing the peaceful chapter she had quietly borrowed was coming to an end. The executive removed his glasses, his expression softening with unmistakable respect. "Miss Hayes," he said quietly, "everyone has been waiting for you." Ethan turned toward Claire with mild curiosity rather than shock. Claire lowered the folder onto the counter and walked forward slowly. "I told everyone I needed time," she answered softly. "Apparently, they found me anyway." Another executive stepped forward, holding a leather portfolio against his chest. "The board has delayed every major decision for nearly a week. Thousands of employees are asking about you. Investors have been calling every hour. The company cannot move forward without its chief executive officer." The words settled gently into the garage like falling snow. Several longtime customers standing nearby exchanged surprised glances as they slowly recognized the woman they had known simply as Claire. Ethan looked from the executive's back toward her, finally understanding why someone who could organize an entire business in a single afternoon had seemed so comfortable doing it. Claire met his eyes with quiet embarrassment. "I wanted 1 week where nobody called me Madam Chief Executive Officer," she admitted. "I wanted to remember who I was before every conversation became about numbers, meetings, and expectations." Silence filled the garage for several seconds before Ethan smiled exactly as he always did. "Well," he said warmly, "have you had lunch yet?" The executives looked at him with visible surprise, almost expecting excitement, disbelief, or endless questions. Instead, Ethan simply walked toward the small refrigerator in the office and removed the sandwiches he had prepared that morning. Nobody should make important decisions on an empty stomach, he said as naturally as if Claire had just told him she worked at the local grocery store. Claire could not hold back a quiet laugh that quickly became emotional. She accepted the sandwich with both hands, blinking away unexpected tears. Throughout her career, she had attended formal dinners costing thousands of dollars. Yet nothing had ever felt as meaningful as standing inside a modest repair garage holding a homemade turkey sandwich offered without admiration for her wealth or fear of her position. Lily arrived from school only minutes later and ran toward the office carrying her backpack. "Claire," she called happily, "I got an A on my science project." Claire knelt to celebrate with her before standing once more beside the waiting executives. She looked around the little garage one final time, taking in the shelves she had organized, the familiar scent of motor oil mixed with fresh coffee, the old wooden counter where customers shared stories instead of complaints, and Ethan quietly returning to finish repairing a stranger's truck before asking another question about her extraordinary life. In that simple moment, Claire realized something no business school had ever taught her. Real greatness was never announced by expensive titles or towering office buildings. Sometimes it quietly wore a faded denim jacket, lived in a small Montana farmhouse, and treated every human being with exactly the same measure of respect. Claire left Montana the following morning just after sunrise. Yet the farewell felt nothing like the dramatic departures that newspapers often described when powerful people returned to their extraordinary lives. There were no flashing cameras, no speeches, and no celebration waiting outside the farmhouse. Instead, there was only crisp mountain air, the gentle rustling of pine trees, and three people standing quietly on a weathered wooden porch that had become more meaningful than any executive office Claire had ever known. Lily hugged Claire tightly before carefully placing the familiar blue knitted blanket into her hands. "Keep it until you need it again," she said with the simple wisdom only a child could offer. "Then bring it back when you come visit us." Claire looked down at the blanket for several seconds before smiling through grateful eyes. "That is a promise I intend to keep," she replied softly. Ethan carried her small leather bag to the waiting vehicle parked beside the gravel driveway. Neither of them seemed interested in filling the silence with unnecessary words because some moments were too honest to improve with conversation. Finally, Claire turned toward him. "You never asked who I was," she said quietly. Ethan slipped both hands into the pockets of his faded denim jacket and smiled with the same calm expression she had first seen on the stormy night outside his front door. "You told me your name was Claire," he answered. "That was enough for me." She lowered her eyes for a moment, realizing that no board meeting, no award, and no financial achievement had ever made her feel as genuinely respected as those simple words. One of the executives approached carefully, waiting until Claire nodded before opening the rear passenger door. As the line of black sport utility vehicles slowly disappeared down the gravel road, Ethan remained beside Lily until the last trace of dust settled back onto the quiet valley. Life resumed almost immediately. Customers still arrived needing brake repairs, oil changes, and engine work. Bills still needed to be paid. Lily still hurried home from school each afternoon, eager to tell her father everything she had learned. Yet the farmhouse somehow felt both quieter and fuller at the same time, as though kindness had left behind a permanent echo inside its walls. Nearly 2,000 miles away in downtown Chicago, Claire stepped once again into the towering headquarters that bore her company's name across polished glass and steel. Employees lined the lobby with relieved smiles, and executives greeted her with carefully prepared reports, meeting schedules, and urgent decisions waiting for her signature. She thanked each person politely before walking into the executive boardroom, where the familiar skyline stretched beyond floor-to-ceiling windows. Everything looked exactly as she had left it only days earlier, but she no longer saw the room in quite the same way. During her first meeting, the discussion quickly turned toward quarterly profits, expansion strategies, and shareholder expectations. Claire listened patiently before closing the presentation folder in front of her. Before we discuss numbers, she said calmly, I want every proposal to answer one question. How does this improve the lives of the people who trust us? The room became unusually quiet. Several executives exchanged thoughtful glances because the question sounded simple, yet it changed the direction of the entire conversation. That evening, after everyone else had gone home, Claire stood alone in her office holding the blue, knitted blanket folded neatly across the back of a chair. Beyond the glass windows, thousands of city lights stretched toward the horizon, but none of them reminded her of success. Instead, she thought about a modest repair garage where honesty mattered more than image, a wooden kitchen table where homemade soup carried more comfort than luxury, and a father who had looked beyond titles to see the person standing quietly behind them. At that moment, Claire understood that returning to Chicago did not mean leaving Montana behind. The greatest lesson she had carried home was not packed inside her leather bag or written inside any business report. It lived quietly within her heart, reminding her every single day that true leadership always begins with the courage to treat every stranger with dignity before knowing anything else about them. The weeks that followed transformed more than quarterly reports and executive meetings. They quietly transformed Claire herself. Every morning before the first conference call, she unfolded the blue knitted blanket and draped it across the back of the chair at her private office. Not because she needed warmth, but because it reminded her of the kind of person she wanted to remain. Whenever difficult decisions filled the agenda, she remembered a small repair garage where every customer had been treated with equal respect regardless of the size of the repair bill. Slowly, that philosophy began shaping the culture of an entire company. Executives who had once measured success only through financial charts found themselves discussing employees, families, local communities, and long-term trust with the same seriousness they once reserved for profit margins. During one leadership meeting, Claire surprised everyone by announcing a new nationwide initiative called the Second Chance Partnership, a program designed to provide affordable equipment, business mentoring, and emergency financial assistance to independently owned family businesses across America. She explained that the strongest communities were built not by giant corporations alone, but by honest people who unlocked their doors before sunrise every day, worked with dignity, and quietly served their neighbors without expecting recognition. No one in the room knew the true inspiration behind the project except Claire herself. She never mentioned Ethan's name. She never described the farmhouse in Montana or the little garage beside it. Some stories, she believed, became even more powerful when they remained acts of gratitude instead of public announcements. Within months, hundreds of small businesses received practical support that allowed them to hire new employees, repair aging equipment, or survive difficult seasons that might otherwise have forced them to close forever. Across the country, families who had never heard of Claire Hayes personally began benefiting from a decision born inside a quiet farmhouse kitchen over bowls of homemade soup. Meanwhile, life in Montana continued with the same steady rhythm Ethan appreciated every day. Autumn gradually surrendered to early winter as light snow covered the valley and frost decorated the garage windows each morning. Ethan remained completely unaware that one of his longtime customers had quietly nominated his repair shop for a National Small Business Excellence Award after noticing how much more efficiently everything operated in recent months. Ethan accepted the nomination letter with humble surprise, assuming someone had simply been generous. He smiled, thanked the customer, and returned to replacing an alternator before lunchtime. Recognition had never been his goal. Honest work always had been. One snowy afternoon, Lily arrived home from school carrying a colorful envelope addressed to Ethan. Inside was a handwritten holiday card signed only with the first name Claire. The message was simple. Thank you for reminding me that leadership begins at the front door of an ordinary home. The blue blanket still waits beside my office every morning, and every important decision I make begins with remembering your kindness. I promised Lily that I would return it, and I always keep my promises. Ethan read the letter twice before carefully placing it inside the family photo album, where he kept the memories that mattered most. He looked out the kitchen window toward the snow-covered garage, then quietly smiled to himself. He had repaired thousands of vehicles throughout his life, but he had never imagined that opening his home to one exhausted stranger would somehow help people he would probably never meet. Far away in Chicago, Claire stood beside the window of her office watching fresh snow drift between towering buildings. The city continued moving with endless speed beneath her, yet her thoughts traveled back to a peaceful valley where dignity required no announcement, generosity expected no reward, and one quiet family had forever changed the way she understood success. She gently folded the blue blanket once more, knowing with complete certainty that some promises were too meaningful to remain unfinished. Winter settled comfortably over the Montana Valley, covering the fields, pine trees, and quiet gravel roads with a blanket of fresh snow that reflected the soft morning sunlight like polished glass. Ethan continued opening the repair garage before dawn each day, brushing snow away from the entrance before the first customers arrived, while Lily counted the days until Christmas with the excitement that only children could carry. Life remained beautifully ordinary, and Ethan considered that to be one of life's greatest blessings. One bright Saturday morning, while he was replacing the battery in an old ranch truck, the familiar sound of tires rolling slowly across the gravel driveway caused him to glance toward the road. This time there was only one dark sport utility vehicle instead of an entire convoy. It stopped quietly beside the garage, and the driver's door opened. Claire stepped out wearing a warm, camel-colored winter coat, leather boots, and a knitted scarf wrapped around her neck. There were no executives, no assistants, no photographers, and no security team following behind her. She carried only a small canvas travel bag in one hand and something carefully folded in the other. Ethan smiled before saying a single word, as though no time had passed since the day she left. "Welcome back, Claire." She returned the smile with visible relief. "It is good to be home for a little while," she answered. The word home escaped naturally before she even realized she had spoken aloud. Lily came running from the farmhouse the moment she recognized Claire, her laughter echoing across the snowy yard. She wrapped her arms tightly around Claire, who laughed with genuine joy before kneeling to return the embrace. "I believe this belongs to you," Claire said as she carefully unfolded the familiar blue knitted blanket and placed it gently into Lily's hands. "I promised I would bring it back." Lily hugged the blanket against her chest before smiling proudly. "I knew you would." Ethan quietly watched the exchange, understanding that the blanket had become something far more valuable than fabric. It had become a promise kept, a symbol of trust that neither distance nor success could erase. Later that afternoon, the three of them sat around the old wooden kitchen table, sharing bowls of homemade chili, warm cornbread, and apple pie that Lily had helped bake. Conversation flowed as naturally as it had before. Claire spoke about the small businesses that had received support through the Second Chance Partnership, describing family-owned bakeries, repair shops, farms, bookstores, and neighborhood businesses that now had opportunities to grow because someone had believed in them. Ethan listened carefully, never asking how much the program had cost or how many headlines it had generated. Instead, he asked only one question: did it help people? Claire smiled warmly. "More than I ever imagined." She then reached in her travel bag and placed a simple folder on the table. "There is something else I would like to ask." Ethan opened it and found information describing a volunteer advisory council made up of small business owners from different parts of the country. Claire explained that the council would help ensure every decision remained practical, honest, and centered on real communities instead of corporate assumptions. "I cannot think of anyone better suited for it than you," she said sincerely. Ethan looked through the pages before gently closing the folder. "I have never considered myself an expert." Claire shook her head with quiet confidence. "That is exactly why you are." Silence settled gently across the kitchen as snow continued falling outside the windows. In that peaceful moment, neither wealth nor titles carried any importance. What mattered was that a successful leader had returned not to impress the people who had once sheltered her, but to continue learning from them. And as the afternoon sunlight faded across the snow-covered valley, Claire realized that the greatest investment she would ever make was not in another company or another building, but in the ordinary people whose quiet dignity had forever changed the direction of her life. Spring arrived quietly in the Montana Valley, replacing snow-covered fields with fresh green grass, wildflowers, and the familiar sounds of birds greeting each new sunrise. Months had passed since Claire's return, and although she divided her time between Chicago and Montana, the distance no longer felt like a barrier. She often joined advisory meetings through simple video calls from Ethan's small office above the repair garage, where practical conversations about family businesses carried more influence than polished presentations inside skyscrapers. The Second Chance Partnership continued expanding across the country, helping independent mechanics, family-owned diners, neighborhood hardware stores, and small farms remain open through difficult seasons. Every recommendation Ethan offered came from years of honest experience rather than corporate theory, and Claire noticed that the most successful decisions almost always began with his simplest observations. He never tried to impress anyone. He simply remembered what it felt like to struggle and refused to forget the people still living that reality. One Saturday afternoon, the town gathered for its annual community fair, where local businesses displayed handmade crafts, homemade food, and classic cars restored by proud owners. Ethan parked an old pickup truck outside the garage that had recently won the Regional Small Business Excellence Award, but instead of placing the trophy in the front window, he left it on a shelf inside the office beside family photographs and Lilly Science Fair ribbon. When one customer congratulated him, Ethan smiled warmly and replied, "Awards are nice, but trust is what keeps the lights on." Claire overheard those words while helping Lily serve homemade lemonade at a small table beside the garage. She smiled because she recognized the same quiet wisdom that had first changed her life months earlier. Later that evening, after the fair ended and neighbors returned home, the three of them sat together on the familiar wooden porch overlooking the valley as the sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains. The air smelled of fresh pine, wildflowers, and warm earth after a gentle spring rain earlier that afternoon. Lily unfolded the blue knitted blanket and spread it across all three of them, laughing as though it had always been large enough to hold everyone together. Claire looked toward the peaceful landscape before speaking softly. "I spent years believing success meant building the tallest buildings, leading the biggest company, and making the hardest decisions. Then one rainy night, I knocked on the door of a stranger who expected nothing from me except honesty." Ethan shook his head gently. "You were never a stranger for very long." They shared a quiet smile while the last rays of sunlight painted the sky with shades of gold and soft blue. No one hurried to fill the silence because every important truth had already been spoken through ordinary acts of kindness. Claire knew she would return to Chicago again. Ethan knew he would open the garage before sunrise on Monday morning, just as he always had. Lily knew she would keep growing up surrounded by people who measured others by their character instead of their titles. Life would continue, carrying each of them toward new responsibilities and new opportunities to serve others. Yet something lasting had been created in that little farmhouse and repair garage, something no balance sheet could ever calculate. It was the quiet certainty that dignity offered freely could transform a life. That compassion given without questions could become the beginning of hope, and that the greatest wealth any person could ever possess was the courage to open a door before knowing who stood on the other side. As evening settled gently across the Montana Valley and the porch light glowed warmly above them, the world remained beautifully still, and in that peaceful silence, three ordinary hearts reminded one another that second chances are never created by power or fortune alone. They begin with kindness, they grow through trust, and they endure because someone chooses to see the person before the title.